The morning sun filtered through the tall windows of Millbrook County Courthouse, casting long shadows across the worn wooden benches. Sarah Mitchell sat quietly in the back row, her dark hands folded neatly in her lap as she watched other cases being called before hers. She wore a simple navy blue blazer and matching skirt, her natural hair styled professionally, and carried a worn leather briefcase containing her driver's license and insurance documents. Case number 247, Sarah Mitchell, traffic violation, the court clerk announced, her voice echoing through the high-ceilinged room. Sarah stood up, smoothed her skirt, and walked confidently toward the front. Her heels clicked against the marble floor, drawing the attention of the few spectators scattered throughout the courtroom. As she approached the defendant's podium, she could feel Judge Richard Harrison's stern gaze following her every move. Judge Harrison sat high above in his black robe, his weathered face set in what seemed to be a permanent frown. His gray hair and wire-rimmed glasses gave him an appearance of wisdom, but there was something cold in the way he looked down at Sarah. "Ms. Mitchell," he began, emphasizing each syllable as he reviewed the papers before him. "You're here for running a stop sign on Oak Street last Tuesday afternoon. How do you plead?" Sarah cleared her throat and spoke clearly into the microphone. "Your Honor, while I respect the officer's perspective, I believe there's been a misunderstanding. I came to a complete stop at that intersection." Judge Harrison's frown deepened. "Officer Parker," he called, gesturing to the police officer standing nearby, "please present your account." Officer Parker, a young white man with close-cropped blonde hair, stepped forward. "Your Honor, at approximately 2:45 p.m. on Tuesday, I observed Ms. Mitchell's vehicle roll through the stop sign at Oak and Maple. The stop was incomplete, barely a pause." Sarah remained composed as she reached into her briefcase. "Your Honor, I have dashcam footage from my vehicle that shows." "Ms. Mitchell," Judge Harrison interrupted, his voice sharp, "are you suggesting Officer Parker is not telling the truth?" The courtroom fell silent. Sarah took a deep breath before responding. "No, Your Honor. I'm simply trying to present evidence that might help clarify the situation." "The officer's testimony is quite clear," Judge Harrison said, shuffling some papers on his desk without even glancing at Sarah's evidence. "This court has no reason to doubt the word of a respected law enforcement officer." Sarah noticed how the judge's tone had shifted from stern to dismissive. She had seen this before, not just as someone on the receiving end, but as an observer of countless similar scenarios. But today, she was here as an ordinary citizen, not in her professional capacity. "Your Honor, I understand, but—" "That's enough," Judge Harrison cut her off again. "Given your apparent lack of respect for both traffic laws and this court's time, I'm imposing the maximum fine of $300. Let this serve as a reminder to obey all traffic signals completely." Sarah stood perfectly still, her expression neutral despite the unfairness of the situation. The fine wasn't the issue. She could afford it. What bothered her was the judge's refusal to even consider her evidence or hear her full explanation. Behind her, she could hear whispers from the gallery. A young law clerk at the side of the courtroom was frowning, scribbling something in his notepad. Officer Parker shifted uncomfortably, perhaps sensing that the punishment was unusually harsh for a first-time traffic offense. "Do you understand the court's decision, Ms. Mitchell?" Judge Harrison asked, already reaching for the next case file. "Yes, Your Honor." Sarah replied quietly, her voice steady despite her inner frustration. She gathered her belongings, turned around, and walked back down the aisle with her head held high. As she pushed through the heavy wooden doors of the courthouse, Sarah couldn't help but think about the irony of the situation. In less than 2 hours, she was scheduled to give a keynote speech about judicial bias at the Women's Rights Conference in the next county. Her personal experience today would add another powerful example to representation, though not in the way she would have wished. The morning sun was now high in the sky as Sarah descended the courthouse steps. She pulled out her phone to check the time, knowing she needed to hurry to make it to her speaking engagement. Little did Judge Harrison know, his actions today would soon become part of a much larger conversation about justice and equality in their small town. Sarah Mitchell drove her car carefully through the busy streets of downtown, making sure to come to a complete stop at every sign. The irony of her excessive caution wasn't lost on her as she headed toward the Women's Rights Conference at the Grand Plaza Hotel. Her phone buzzed with messages from the conference organizers, wondering where their keynote speaker was. Inside the hotel's bustling lobby, a young volunteer rushed to meet her. "Ms. Mitchell, everyone's been waiting. Are you okay? You're never late." "I had an unexpected delay at the courthouse," Sarah replied, quickly checking her appearance in a mirror. Despite the morning's frustration, she looked composed in her navy suit. Only the slight tightness around her eyes hinted at her earlier encounter with Judge Harrison. The conference hall was packed with over 300 women of all ages and backgrounds. As Sarah walked onto the stage, the crowd burst into applause. Many of these women knew her story, how she had risen from a small-town girl to become one of the country's most respected women's rights activists. Standing at the podium, Sarah took a deep breath. "Ladies, I had a different speech planned for today," she began, her voice clear and strong. "But something happened this morning that perfectly shows why our work is so important." The room fell silent as Sarah described her experience in Judge Harrison's courtroom. She didn't mention the judge by name, but she explained how the system had failed her, a woman who had spent 15 years fighting for justice. "What that judge didn't know," Sarah continued, "was that just last month, our organization helped pass the Fair Courts Act in 3 states. This law requires judges to review all evidence before making decisions, especially in cases involving minorities." The audience nodded in understanding. Many of them had worked with Sarah on various projects over the years. They had seen her build her organization, Women for Equal Justice, from a small local group to a national movement with offices in 12 cities. Sarah clicked to the next slide, showing statistics about bias in traffic stops. 10 years ago, I was a young lawyer who noticed a pattern. Women, especially women of color, were receiving harsher punishments for the same offenses. That's when I knew I had to do something. She walked across the stage, her voice growing stronger. Since then, we've helped over 10,000 women fight unfair treatment in courts. We trained 200 female lawyers. We've changed laws in 15 states. But today showed me that we still have so much work to do. In the audience, phones began to light up as people shared Sarah's story on social media. Her morning in court was quickly becoming a trending topic. #JusticeForSarah and #CourtroomBS started appearing on Twitter. At the back of the room, a news reporter from the local station was filming. Sarah noticed but kept focused on her message. She had learned long ago that personal stories could create powerful change. "Last year, we helped a single mother keep her driver's license when a judge wanted to suspend it over a parking ticket. That license meant she could keep her job and support her children. These aren't just traffic violations, they're about people's lives." Sarah showed more slides, graphs of their success rates, pictures of women they'd helped, headlines about laws they'd changed. Each image represented countless hours of work, late nights writing appeals, and meetings with legislators. "Some people ask me why I care so much about seemingly small issues like traffic court bias," Sarah said, nearing the end of her speech. "I tell them that justice isn't small or large, it's either present or it's not. And today, in that courtroom, it wasn't present." The crowd rose to their feet, applauding. Many were taking pictures, sharing quotes online, spreading Sarah's message far beyond the conference walls. What had started as a frustrating morning was becoming a rallying cry for change. As Sarah stepped down from the stage, her phone buzzed again. This time it was her assistant. "Ms. Mitchell, several news stations want to interview you about what happened in court today. Someone posted about it online, and the story is spreading fast." Sarah smiled slightly, thinking about Judge Harrison and wondering if he had any idea who he dismissed so quickly in his courtroom. She hadn't planned for this morning's incident to become part of her activism, but sometimes the best opportunities for change came from unexpected places. The local Channel 5 news van pulled up outside the Grand Plaza Hotel just as Sarah was finishing her last interview of the afternoon. Inside, the conference halls were still buzzing with excitement, but now it wasn't just about women's rights. It was about what had happened in Judge Harrison's courtroom that morning. "Ms. Mitchell, can you tell us more about your experience today?" asked Lisa Chen, the lead reporter from Channel 5. Her cameraman adjusted his equipment as Sarah sat down in one of the hotel's quiet meeting rooms. The afternoon sun streamed through large windows, creating a warm, professional backdrop. "I think what happened this morning highlights a bigger problem in our justice system," Sarah explained, her voice calm and measured. She had done hundreds of interviews over the years, but this one felt different. more personal. Meanwhile, across town at the courthouse, Judge Richard Harrison was getting ready to end his day when his clerk rushed in with a tablet. "Your Honor, you need to see this," the young man said nervously, showing him the local news website. The headline read, "Renowned civil rights activist faces discrimination in local court." Below it was a picture of Sarah Mitchell speaking at the Women's Rights Conference, alongside a list of her achievements. Founder of Women for Equal Justice, recipient of the National Civil Rights Award, advisor to 3 state governors on judicial reform. Judge Harrison's face grew pale as he read further. The article mentioned how Sarah's organization had helped pass laws requiring bodycam footage reviews and traffic stops, the very evidence he had refused to look at that morning. Back at the hotel, Sarah's phone wouldn't stop ringing. News outlets from neighboring states wanted interviews. Social media was exploding with support. #JusticeForSarah had reached over 50,000 tweets in just a few hours. "Look at this," said Maria, Sarah's assistant, showing her a Facebook post. It was from Officer Parker, the policeman from the traffic stop. He had written a long message explaining how uncomfortable he had felt about the judge's harsh treatment and expressing his respect for Sarah's work in the community. The story kept growing. A local blogger had dug up statistics about Judge Harrison's court. Women of color received fines averaging 40% higher than other defendants for similar violations. Sarah hadn't known these numbers when she stood in his courtroom, but now they added weight to her experience. By evening, national news networks were picking up the story. They played clips from Sarah's conference speech alongside interviews with other women who had faced similar treatment in traffic courts across the country. What had started as a simple traffic violation was becoming a symbol of a larger fight for equality. "Ms. Mitchell," called out a reporter as Sarah left the hotel that evening, "will you file a complaint against Judge Harrison?" Sarah paused thoughtfully before answering. "This isn't about one judge or one court appearance," she said. "It's about making sure our justice system works fairly for everyone, from the biggest cases to the smallest traffic violations." Her phone buzzed again. This time it was an email from a group of law students at the state university. They wanted to study her case as part of their project on judicial bias. They had already collected statements from people who had been in the courtroom that morning, including the young law clerk who had seemed troubled by the judge's behavior. As Sarah drove home that evening, she passed by the courthouse again. The building looked different now in the fading light, less intimidating, more like a place that needed change rather than a place that inspired fear. Local TV stations were running the story on their evening news. In homes across the city, people watched and talked about what had happened. Some defended Judge Harrison, saying he was just being strict. Others shared their own stories of unfair treatment in his courtroom. Sarah's dashboard clock showed 7:30 p.m. In just 12 hours, her routine traffic court appearance had turned into a national conversation about justice and equality. As she pulled into her driveway, her phone lit up with one more notification. The state's Judicial Review Board wanted to meet with her. The media storm was far from over. In fact, it was just beginning to gather strength. Judge Harrison arrived at the courthouse early the next morning, long before the sunrise. Dark circles under his eyes showed he hadn't slept much. He hadn't sent the email to Sarah Mitchell yet. The words never seemed quite right. The empty courthouse halls echoed with his footsteps as he walked to his office. On his desk, a stack of case files waited for review. Today's cases. But for the first time in 20 years, he didn't feel ready to enter his courtroom. "Your Honor," his clerk, Tom, appeared at the door. "The Judicial Review Board is here early. They're waiting in the conference room." Richard straightened his black robe and took a deep breath. In the conference room, 3 senior judges sat waiting. Judge Maria Rodriguez, whom he had known for 15 years, spoke first. "Richard, we've been reviewing your cases from the past 5 years," she said, sliding a thick folder across the table. "The patterns are concerning." Inside the folder were charts and statistics, numbers that told the story he hadn't wanted to see before. Women of color received fines averaging 45% higher than white defendants. Their cases were decided 30% faster. Their evidence was rejected 60% more often. "I thought I was being efficient," Richard said quietly, staring at the numbers. "I thought I was being fair." Judge Rodriguez leaned forward. "There's more. We've had 17 complaints about bias in your courtroom this year alone. We didn't act because your conviction rates were good. Maybe that was our mistake too. Outside the conference room windows, the morning sun was rising over the city. Richard could see people starting to gather for today's court sessions. Among them would be more people like Sarah Mitchell. People with stories to tell, evidence to share, circumstances to consider. His phone buzzed in his pocket. Another message from his daughter. Dad, my law professor used your case as an example in class today. Not in a good way. Are you okay? The weight of 20 years of decisions pressed down on him. How many lives had he affected? How many people had suffered because he refused to look past his own biases? We're not here to punish you, Richards, said Judge Rodriguez. We're here to help you do better. Sarah Mitchell's organization offers training for judges on recognizing unconscious bias. Maybe it's time we all took it. Back in his chambers, Richard found an old case file from 3 years ago. A young black woman had been fined heavily for a broken taillight. She had tried to explain that she was a single mother, that she had already bought the replacement light, but couldn't afford the mechanic's fee to install it. He hadn't listened. The fine had forced her to choose between fixing her car and buying food for her children. His computer screen showed new email notifications, more news coverage, more public reactions, more stories coming out about his past decisions. Some defenders called him tough but fair. Others shared stories of leaving his courtroom feeling unheard, unseen, unjustly treated. Richard picked up his gavel, feeling its familiar weight. For 20 years, this small wooden hammer had given him the power to affect people's lives. Had he wielded that power with wisdom, with justice, with compassion? The morning sun now filled his office completely. In 30 minutes, he would need to enter his courtroom and face today's cases. But something had changed. The certainty he had felt for so many years was gone, replaced by questions he couldn't ignore anymore. He opened his computer and finally finished the email to Sarah Mitchell. This time, the words came easily. Dear Ms. Mitchell, yesterday in my courtroom, I failed to deliver justice. But you've shown me that acknowledging our failures is the first step toward creating real change. I have much to learn, and I'm ready to listen. If you're willing, I would like to meet with you to discuss how I can do better, not just for you, but for everyone who enters my courtroom. With sincere regret and hope for change, Judge Richard Harrison. As his finger hovered over the send button, he heard the first case being called in the hallway. Today would be different. Today, he would listen. The State Judicial Conference Center buzzed with activity as judges from across the state gathered for the annual training seminar. Judge Harrison stood at the back of the main hall, feeling strangely nervous. He hadn't worn a robe today, just a simple gray suit that made him feel more human than judge. Our next speaker needs no introduction, announced the conference director. She's been at the forefront of judicial reform for the past decade. Please welcome Sarah Mitchell. The audience applauded as Sarah walked onto the stage. She wore a deep purple suit, her natural hair styled elegantly, and carried herself with the same dignity she had shown in his courtroom 2 weeks ago. Richard noticed many judges nodding in recognition. Clearly, they knew her work well. Thank you, Sarah began, her voice clear and strong. Today, I want to talk about a recent experience that shows why we need change in our courts. She paused, her eyes scanning the room. For a moment, they met Richard's, but she didn't react. 2 weeks ago, I stood in a courtroom as a defendant. The room grew quiet as Sarah shared her story. She didn't mention Richard by name, but everyone knew who she meant. Instead of anger, though, she spoke about opportunity. The opportunity to learn, to grow, to make the justice system better. When a judge refuses to look at evidence, she said, showing a slide with statistics, they're not just dismissing a piece of paper or a video. They're dismissing someone's truth, someone's reality, someone's chance for justice. Richard watched as his colleagues took notes, nodded, and sometimes glanced his way. He had expected judgment or coldness, but instead, he saw reflection on their faces. Many of them were probably thinking about their own courtrooms, their own decisions. Sarah moved to her next slide, but something unexpected happened after that day in court, she continued. The judge reached out to me, he acknowledged his mistake, and that's why I'm here today, because change is possible when we're willing to learn. Richard felt his heart beat faster. He hadn't known she would mention his email. Around him, people were whispering, some turning to look at him directly now. This judge's willingness to learn, Sarah said, shows that it's never too late to change. His email to me wasn't just an apology, it was a commitment to do better. And that's what we need from every person in our justice system. After the presentation, people gathered in small groups, discussing what they heard. Richard stood alone near a window, wondering if he should leave. Then he heard Sarah's voice behind him. "Judge Harrison," she said quietly, "thank you for coming." He turned to face her, noticing she was holding a copy of his email. "Miss Mitchell, I wasn't sure you'd want to see me." Sarah gestured toward a quiet corner with some chairs. "Let's talk," she said simply. They sat down, two people who had first met as judge and defendant, now meeting as equals. Through the windows, afternoon sunlight cast long shadows across the conference center floor. "Your email was unexpected," Sarah began. "But welcome. Not many judges would admit to their biases so openly." Richard nodded slowly. "I've been reviewing all my cases from the past 5 years. The patterns. They're impossible to ignore once you see them." "Recognizing the pattern is the first step," Sarah said. "But what matters now is what you'll do about it." For the next hour, they talked about practical changes, new procedures for reviewing evidence, training programs for court staff, ways to ensure every person who entered the courtroom felt heard and respected. "I can't change my past decisions," Richard said finally, "but I can change how I make future ones." Sarah smiled slightly. "That's exactly why I wanted to meet with you. Tomorrow, I'm starting a new program, training sessions for judges on recognizing and addressing unconscious bias. Would you be interested in helping develop it?" Richard looked at her, surprised. "You want my help? After what happened?" "Sometimes," Sarah said, "the best teachers are the ones who have learned from their mistakes. Your experience, combined with your willingness to change, could help other judges understand why this matters." As they shook hands, Richard noticed other judges watching them. This conversation wasn't just about two people anymore. It was about showing that change was possible, that bridges could be built, that justice could be better. 1 month after the judicial conference, Judge Harrison's courtroom looked very different. Gone was the rushed atmosphere of quick decisions. Instead, a new sense of patience and attention filled the air. On this particular morning, he sat listening carefully to a young woman explaining why she couldn't pay her parking tickets. "Your Honor," the woman said nervously, "I lost my job last month, and I've been trying to find work while taking care of my sick mother." In the past, Richard might have simply demanded payment. Today, he looked through her documentation and asked questions about her situation. Sarah Mitchell sat in the back of the courtroom, watching with quiet approval. "The court will set up a payment plan," Richard announced, "and connect you with our new job assistance program. Please see the clerk for details." The woman's relief was visible as she thanked him and left the podium. Sarah made a note in her notebook, another example for their training program. During the lunch break, Sarah and Richard met in his chambers. The office had changed too. New posters about equal justice hung on the walls, and resource pamphlets filled the information rack. "That was good work this morning," Sarah said, sitting down across from his desk. "You're really listening now." Richard nodded, removing his reading glasses. "I've been thinking about all the times I didn't listen before. Last week, I went through old cases and found 20 people who deserved a second review. We've already helped 5 of them adjust their payment plans or reduce unfair fines." Sarah opened her laptop, showing him their progress report. Together, they had created a new training program for judges called Justice Through Understanding. In just 3 weeks, 30 judges had signed up. "Look at these numbers," Sarah pointed to the screen. "Complaints about unfair treatment in participating courts are down by 40%. People feel heard. They trust the system more." Richard smiled slightly, remembering his own journey. "Yesterday, a lawyer told me she didn't recognize my courtroom anymore. She meant it as a compliment." They spent the next hour reviewing cases and planning the next training session. Sarah had brought in experts on unconscious bias, and Richard shared his own story as a case study. His honesty about his past mistakes helped other judges open up about their own biases. "There's something else," Sarah said, pulling out a newspaper. "The state Supreme Court wants to make our training program mandatory for all judges. They're voting next week." Richard picked up the paper, reading the headline, "Revolutionary Judicial Training Program Changes Lives." Below was a picture of him and Sarah speaking to a group of judges. Did you ever think, he asked, when you walked into my courtroom that day, that we'd end up here? Sarah shook her head. I thought it would be just another example of the system failing. Instead, it became an example of how the system can change. The afternoon session was about to begin. Through his office window, Richard could see people lining up outside his courtroom. Each person had a story, evidence to present, circumstances to consider. Before we start, Sarah said, standing up, there's one more thing. Remember that young mother from last week, the one who couldn't pay her fine? Richard nodded. He had reduced her fine and helped her find resources for her children. She came to our office yesterday, Sarah continued. She's volunteering now, helping other women navigate the court system. Your decision didn't just help her, it inspired her to help others. As they walked back to the courtroom, Richard thought about how much had changed. His robe felt different now, less like a symbol of authority and more like a reminder of responsibility. All rise, the bailiff called out as they entered. Richard took his seat at the bench, noticing how people's faces showed less fear now. Sarah sat in her usual spot at the back, ready to observe and take notes. Before we begin today's session, Richard announced, I want to remind everyone that this court is committed to hearing your full story. We're here to understand, to listen, and to ensure justice is served with compassion and fairness. The transformation wasn't just about new procedures or training programs. It was about changing hearts and minds, one case at a time, one decision at a time, one life at a time. 1 year had passed since that fateful morning in Judge Harrison's courtroom. The State Judicial Center was packed for a special ceremony, with cameras from local news stations positioned throughout the room. On stage, Sarah Mitchell stood at the podium, looking out at the gathered crowd of judges, lawyers, activists, and community members. Today, we celebrate more than just a program, Sarah began, her voice filled with pride. We celebrate a change in how justice works in our state. In the past year, over 500 judges have completed the Justice Through Understanding training. In the front row, Judge Harrison sat quietly, thinking about how far they had come. His gray hair had more silver now, but his eyes were brighter, more alive than they had been in years. Sarah continued, showing slides on the large screen behind her. The numbers tell our story. Bias complaints are down 70% across participating courts. Payment plan approvals have increased by 80%, and most importantly, public trust in our courts has grown significantly. She clicked to the next slide, showing a familiar face, the young mother who had started volunteering last year. Maria Torres now leads our court advocacy program. She has helped over 200 people navigate the justice system, ensuring their voices are heard and their rights protected. In the audience, Maria smiled, wearing a professional suit and holding a folder of case files. Next to her sat 3 other women she had helped, all now volunteers themselves. But perhaps the most powerful part of our success, Sarah said, comes from an unexpected partnership. She gestured toward Judge Harrison. Would you join me on stage, Your Honor? Richard walked up slowly, remembering how differently he had once viewed Sarah. Now they worked together almost daily, reviewing cases, training judges, and building a more compassionate justice system. Judge Harrison could have ignored my email, Sarah told the audience. He could have dismissed the criticism and continued as before. Instead, he chose to learn, to change, and to help others do the same. His story is now taught in law schools across the country. Richard stepped to the podium as Sarah moved aside. A year ago, he began, his voice steady, I thought justice meant being tough, being strict. I was wrong. Justice means being fair. It means listening. It means understanding that behind every case is a human story. He paused, looking at the faces before him. Last week, a young woman came to my court. She reminded me of Ms. Mitchell, confident, prepared, but worried about being treated unfairly. The difference was, this time, she found a court ready to listen, ready to understand, ready to help. The ceremony continued with the governor announcing the expansion of their program to neighboring states. 5 other state Supreme Courts had already requested to adopt their training model. After the ceremony, Sarah and Richard walked through the Judicial Center's halls, where new posters announced their latest initiative, a scholarship program for minority law students interested in becoming judges. Did you see today's numbers? Sarah asked, showing him her tablet. Your courtroom has become a model for the state. Judges from across the country are asking to observe your sessions. Richard stopped at a window, looking out at the courthouse where it all began. Sometimes I still think about that morning, he said quietly. How close I came to missing this opportunity for change. Sarah nodded. That's why we tell the story in every training session. It shows that change can start with one moment, one decision, one person willing to learn. They reached the courthouse steps, where a group of law students waited to interview them for a documentary about judicial reform. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the stone steps where Sarah had once left feeling dismissed and unheard. Ready? She asked Richard, as the students set up their camera. Ready, he replied. You know, my grandson started law school last week. When he called to tell me about his first class, he said they studied our program. He was proud to tell his classmates. That's my grandfather. Sarah smiled. That's the real legacy of what we built. Not just changing today's justice system, but shaping tomorrow's judges. As they sat down for the interview, the courthouse doors behind them opened for the evening session. Inside, courts now operated differently, with patience, understanding, and true justice. The story of a traffic ticket that changed the system had become more than just a story. It had become a movement, a model, and most importantly, a lasting change in how justice was served. 1 year had passed since that fateful morning in Judge Harrison's courtroom. The State Judicial Center was packed for a special ceremony, with cameras from local news stations positioned throughout the room. On stage, Sarah Mitchell stood at the podium, looking out at the gathered crowd of judges, lawyers, activists, and community members. Today, we celebrate more than just a program, Sarah began, her voice filled with pride. We celebrate a change in how justice works in our state. In the past year, over 500 judges have completed the Justice Through Understanding training. In the front row, Judge Harrison sat quietly, thinking about how far they had come. His gray hair had more silver now, but his eyes were brighter, more alive than they had been in years. Sarah continued, showing slides on the large screen behind her. The numbers tell our story. Bias complaints are down 70% across participating courts. Payment plan approvals have increased by 80%. And most importantly, public trust in our courts has grown significantly. She clicked to the next slide, showing a familiar face, the young mother who had started volunteering last year. Maria Torres now leads our court advocacy program. She has helped over 200 people navigate the justice system, ensuring their voices are heard and their rights protected. In the audience, Maria smiled, wearing a professional suit and holding a folder of case files. Next to her sat 3 other women she had helped, all now volunteers themselves. But perhaps the most powerful part of our success, Sarah said, comes from an unexpected partnership. She gestured toward Judge Harrison. Would you join me on stage, Your Honor? Richard walked up slowly, remembering how differently he had once viewed Sarah. Now they worked together almost daily, reviewing cases, training judges, and building a more compassionate justice system. Judge Harrison could have ignored my email, Sarah told the audience. He could have dismissed the criticism and continued as before. Instead, he chose to learn, to change, and to help others do the same. His story is now taught in law schools across the country. Richard stepped to the podium as Sarah moved aside. A year ago, he began, his voice steady, I thought justice meant being tough, being strict. I was wrong. Justice means being fair. It means listening. It means understanding that behind every case is a human story. He paused, looking at the faces before him. Last week, a young woman came to my court. She reminded me of Ms. Mitchell, confident, prepared, but worried about being treated unfairly. The difference was, this time she found a court ready to listen, ready to understand, ready to help. The ceremony continued with the governor announcing the expansion of their program to neighboring states. 5 other state Supreme Courts had already requested to adopt their training model. After the ceremony, Sarah and Richard walked through the Judicial Center's halls, where new posters announced their latest initiative, a scholarship program for minority law students interested in becoming judges. Did you see today's numbers? Sarah asked, showing him her tablet. Your courtroom has become a model for the state. Judges from across the country are asking to observe your sessions. Richard stopped at a window, looking out at the courthouse where it all began. Sometimes I still think about that morning, he said quietly. How close I came to missing this opportunity for change. Sarah nodded. That's why we tell the story in every training session. It shows that change can start with one moment, one decision, one person willing to learn. They reached the courthouse steps, where a group of law students waited to interview them for a documentary about judicial reform. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the stone steps where Sarah had once left feeling dismissed and unheard. "Ready?" she asked Richard as the students set up their camera. "Ready," he replied. "You know, my grandson started law school last week. When he called to tell me about his first class, he said they studied our program. He was proud to tell his classmates. That's my grandfather." Sarah smiled. "That's the real legacy of what we built. Not just changing today's justice system, but shaping tomorrow's judges." As they sat down for the interview, the courthouse doors behind them opened for the evening session. Inside, courts now operated differently, with patience, understanding, and true justice. The story of a traffic ticket that changed the system had become more than just a story. It had become a movement, a model, and most importantly, a lasting change in how justice was served.